One morning, Thomas the tank engine was approaching the Knapford sheds. He'd just completed a run down from Farquhar, and was due to have a drink and take on coal before heading back. As he stopped under the coal tower, he noticed something odd. Bear and James were surrounded by people, with name boards propped against their buffers.
You don't need those signs. I already know who you are.
Thomas joked. James grinned at him, and the man standing in front of him took his photo.
It's for the railway's website, Thomas. They're putting a profile of each of us on it.
I see. Are they doing that for all the engines?
As far as I know, Mr. Tyler's booked us to photograph all of you. You're on the Farquhar branch, aren't you? Thomas knew the photographer was talking about Adam Tyler, the railway's Director of Consumer and Public Relations.
That's right.
Then I'll be photographing you the day after tomorrow.
Why does the railway want to put profiles of us on the internet? I mean, there are those books that Thin Clergyman wrote, and the TV series based off them.
Both of those are more about events and stories, Thomas. These profiles will be more along the lines of factual biographies about us. You know, details that didn't make it into the books or TV series.
Oh, I understand.
A short while later, Thomas had been turned, and was bringing Annie and Clarabelle to the station. From the other platform, Edward glanced over.
Hello, Thomas. You're looking a bit puzzled.
I was just thinking, do you know the railway's putting profiles of us on the internet?
Yes, Boko and I had our photos taken yesterday.
Well, Bear says one of the reasons is to give detailed information about us. I was just wondering if that would include some of the engines who used to work on the railway.
I can't see why not, Thomas. We do have a history section on the website after all.
The two engines looked over to see the Fat Controller standing on the platform.
Did you have anyone in particular in mind?
Actually, Mum, I did. Have you heard of Lily?
I remember Grandad telling me the stories of an engine with that name when I was a little girl. She used to work on the Aylesbury line, didn't she?
That's correct, Mum. She was one of the former Wildnorwester and Sodor railway engines. I worked with her on the Aylesbury branch line for a couple of weeks before I took charge of my own line. She taught me most of what I know about looking after branch lines.
What happened to her?
Thomas's face fell.
In 1934, the railway was desperate for money. The board of directors voted to scrap the older engines. I don't think your great-grandfather was too happy about it himself. Lily was sold to Crock's scrapyard line with Roger, Clive, Colin and Adam. Neil was bought by the McBurnett factory in Scotland. That was the last I saw of Lily.
I see.
The Fat Controller was about to leave when Edward spoke up.
Thomas, did you say Lily was taken to Crock's scrapyard?
Yes. That's the scrapyard where you found Trevor, wasn't it?
Yes, but I don't recall seeing Lily there.
You don't?
I remember seeing Roger and Clive there, as well as the Wellsworth and Sudbury engines, but Lily wasn't among them.
Are you sure?
Quite sure, Thomas. I passed that scrapyard daily. Seeing other engines there isn't the type of thing a locomotive forgets.
Thomas considered Edward's words.
But if Lily wasn't there, she may have gone somewhere else.
I'm sorry, Thomas, but I wouldn't get my hopes up. If Lily did somehow avoid being scrapped, surely she would have shown up by now.
Thomas looked sadly at Edward. As much as he hoped Lily was still around, he knew Edward had a point.
I suppose you're right, Edward.
His guard whistled a moment later, and the little tank engine chuffed off despondently. The Fat Controller watched him go. She then turned to Edward.
Edward, are you absolutely sure Lily wasn't in the scrapyard?
Quite sure, ma'am. As I said, it's not something an engine forgets easily.
Thank you, Edward.
A moment later, it was Edward's turn to depart. As he chuffed off, the Fat Controller was lost in thought. It seemed pretty clear that Lily hadn't gone to the scrapyard, and that did raise the question of where she'd ended up. Lily had been a part of the North West Railway family, the Fat Controller thought, and she deserved to have her story told. A couple of days later, it was the Farquhar engine's turn to have their photos taken.
Can't you just take the photo?
Percy asked, annoyed. as the photographer adjusted the angle of his shot for the fourth time. "It's not that simple, Percy. He has to get the right shot." All four engines looked up to see Adam Tyler standing just outside their shed.
Hello, Mr. Tyler. What brings you here?
In a word, Lily.
The engine you used to run the Little Western?
The very same. Ms. Hutt asked me to look into what happened to her back in 1934.
Have you found something?
Yes, I checked the railway's archive. Lily's last recorded movement was on the 11th of March, 1934. After that, she seems to have disappeared from the railway's records. But I did find something interesting in the records of the scrapyard.
What sort of something?
A letter dated the 10th of March, signed by Lily's driver and fireman. It referred to an enclosed £170 as full payment for their locomotive. It looks as though they bought her off the scrappers.
So she could still be around somewhere.
Adam smiled wryly. Well, I checked the island out on Google Earth and couldn't find any obvious places where she could be hidden. The old Ballyhoo cut-off tunnel was the only real possibility. Percy frowned, confused.
Isn't that where Peter was found in 1996?
It was, yes. Maybe he might know something about her.
Later that afternoon, Thomas was shunting at Elsbridge when Peter arrived to drop off some trucks.
Peter, can I ask you something?
By all means, Thomas.
You were put into that Ballyhoo tunnel in 1966, weren't you?
Thomas asked. It had been a top-secret project by the Ministry of Defence to examine the viability of a secret, strategic steam reserve. After the project had been found non-viable, Peter had been left in the tunnel at his own request.
That's correct. Why'd you ask?
Thomas explained about Lily's disappearance.
So, I was just wondering, was the tunnel completely empty when you arrived?
I'm afraid so, Thomas. None of the officers involved mentioned another engine being in there at all.
A sad look crossed Thomas's face.
I think you might be better off talking to the engines who were here in 1934, Thomas. After all, that was when Lily disappeared. One of them may know something.
It's possible, I suppose, but surely they'd have mentioned it.
Not if they don't know they know it.
You've got a point, Peter. I'll ask around.
Thomas wasted no time in asking the other engines if they knew of Lily's fate. But, unfortunately, he didn't meet with much success. None of the engines he asked seemed to know anything about Lily's disappearance. He went to the engines of the Little Western, too. After all, that had once been Lily's line, and they may have heard something. Thomas also discussed it with the Skarloey railway engines. After all, they'd been on Sodor much longer than he had. A couple of days after Thomas had started making his inquiries, Jeff was shunting some trucks into the steamworks.
"Hello, Jeff. Is there any news from the railway?"
Gordon asked, from where his repairs were being carried out. He'd been there for close to 2 months now, and was missing the other engines. Jeff chuckled.
"I'm not sure if you'd call it news, Gordon, but Thomas is trying to find out about Lily."
"Lily? Oh, that tank engine who used to run Duck's branch line. I didn't know her that well, but from what I heard she was a proper lady. What did Thomas want to know about her?"
"He thinks she wasn't really scrapped. He's been trying to find out if anyone might know what happened to her."
"I see."
Gordon was about to say more, when a half-forgotten memory came back to him.
"Maybe I do."
"Oh?"
Jeff asked.
"That brake van assigned to Sheffield. What's his name?"
"Brian?"
"Yes, Brian. He was found in a shed by the Kirk Ronan docks, wasn't he?"
"Yes, why do you ask?"
"One stormy night in 1934, I was returning with the express. I was flagged to a halt at Kelsthorpe Road. The station master there informed me that there was debris over the line between Kildane and Marron, and that trains were being held until it was cleared. But, as I waited, I was sure I could hear the sound of an engine heading down the branch line. My driver could hear it too, but I thought I could see a tank engine moving. That was a couple of months after the branch was closed. I don't think I saw Lily after that incident."
Gordon glanced over at Jeff.
If Lily did go down that branch line, Brian may have heard her. We steam engines aren't exactly silent after all.
I'm due to take these trucks down to Knapford later. I'll be sure to mention it.
Thank you.
Later that evening, Sheffield arrived at Tidmouth, where Thomas was taking on coal. He glanced over as he pulled into the yard.
What's this about a missing engine, Thomas? Brian's been mopping about it all afternoon.
What do you mean?
Jeff spoke to me earlier. Gordon told him he thought Lily went down the Kirkrunnan branch. As you know, I'd been shut up in the shed at Kirkrunnan for a couple of months by then. I usually slept, but storms woke me. One stormy night, I heard the workers at the docks talking to somebody else, someone with a female voice. I thought it sounded like Lily, but I knew it couldn't be her. After all, the land was closed. Anyway, whoever she was put aboard a ship called the Errant Venture, which left port later that night. It was only after I spoke to Jeff that I realised that was Lily. She must have rolled into Kirkrunnan by gravity.
You mean she wasn't scrapped?
Not scrapped, no.
What's wrong with that?
Thomas asked, wondering why Brian seemed rather upset. I overheard some of the dock workers talking the next day. As I said, it was a stormy night when Lily was put aboard the Errant Venture. That ship was lost at sea. The crew made it to the Isle of Man, but the ship and its cargo were never recovered. Thomas's face fell, and for a moment Sheffield thought he was about to cry.
I'm sorry, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thomas sadly chuffed off, without another word. A few days later, around morning tea time, Thomas arrived at Elsbridge to find the Fat Controller waiting. He was still a bit down, following Brian's revelation.
Good morning, Mum.
Morning, Thomas. Sheffield and Brian told me about Lily the morning after they spoke to you. I checked the Kirkrunnan Harbour records. The Errant Venture's manifest did have one steam tank locomotive listed.
The Fat Controller paused, for a moment.
I'm sorry, Thomas. I know she was a good friend of yours. We've already put a story up on the website. It was the least we could do.
At least we know what happened.
Despite Edward's warning, Thomas had been hoping that Lily may have been rescued, somehow. Then, another thought struck him.
Mum, I don't think we've got the full story.
What do you mean?
Thomas thought back, remembering the dark days of the Great Depression.
Mr. Tyler said Lily's crew paid the scrapyard £170 for her. That was a lot of money in those days. A railway crew would have found that sort of money hard to come by.
I noticed that too, Thomas, so I did a bit of research. It seems my great-grandfather, the first Sir Topham, provided the money and arranged for Lily to be put on the Errant Venture.
Thomas gasped.
Cinders and dashes. The Fat Director?
Yes, it's all detailed in the journal he kept. I found it amongst my grandfather's papers a few years ago, but I hadn't really had much of a chance or reason to look at it.
But if it was the Fat Director, why did he need to sneak Lily to Kirkrunnan?
The board of directors weren't happy about him saving Neil a few weeks earlier. They were trying to present a modern image for the railway, and saving old engines didn't fit with that. No place for sentimentality, according to the financial director of the day. Sir Topham couldn't be seen to be acting against their wishes.
That sounds familiar.
It's what Norman Spencer was saying a couple of months ago.
Oh, I meant back then, Mum. Do you know where Lily was going?
She was to have joined Neil at McBunnett's factory in Scotland. Shipping her up there was the most direct and discreet option. The Errant Venture was the only ship available to take her at such short notice.
I see.
Unfortunately, Thomas thought, the Fat Director's efforts had all been for naught. But at least he'd tried, and it was some comfort to know now what had happened. Thomas departed a moment later. The Fat Controller headed for her car. As she reached the car park, her phone chimed. She pulled it out, reading the email she'd just received. Then she reread it, not quite believing what she was seeing.
Well, that's interesting.
A moment later, she climbed into her car and drove off. Arrangements needed to be made.